There are certain kinds of knowledge that become dangerous the moment they leave the shadows. Knowledge that, once possessed, transforms the bearer into something else entirely. Someone who sees possibilities where others see only routine, who understands that power doesn't always announce itself with noise and force. In the autumn of 1841, in Madison County, Mississippi, there lived a woman whose knowledge made her the most feared person on the Riverside estate, though few would ever dare speak this truth aloud. Her name was Hannah, and she had spent 23 years in the plantation kitchen, learning secrets that went far beyond the preparation of meals. The kitchen stood separate from the main house, a deliberate distance that the plantation owner, Edward Collier, had always insisted upon. Fire hazards, he would explain to visitors. But those who worked in that kitchen understood a different truth. It was a kingdom unto itself, and Hannah ruled it with absolute precision. She knew every poison that grew on the property, not because she had studied them with malicious intent, but because the knowledge had accumulated slowly, inevitably, through years of careful observation, and whispered warnings passed between those who worked the land. Which mushrooms caused violent sickness, which berries stopped the heart within hours, which seeds, when crushed into powder, could mimic the symptoms of natural illness so perfectly that no physician would question the diagnosis. The white oleander that grew beside the garden path, the Jimson weed hidden among the cotton rows, the castor beans cultivated for their oil, the foxglove that bloomed purple and deadly in the medicinal garden Mrs. Collier tended with such pride. Hannah knew them all. She had learned their properties not from books she couldn't read, but from experience earned through tragedy and survival. She had watched a child die after eating nightshade berries, mistaking them for wild grapes. She had seen a field hand collapse after handling water hemlock while clearing irrigation ditches. She had observed the careful measurements Mrs. Collier used when preparing her tonics and tinctures, understanding through repetition which plants healed and which merely masked suffering before delivering death. This knowledge had become Hannah's insurance, though she had never consciously thought of it that way. In a world where she possessed nothing, where even her own body belonged to another, this information represented a form of currency she kept hidden, never spending, always aware of its presence like a coin pressed against her palm. The Riverside Plantation encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of rich bottomland along the Pearl River. Cotton dominated the fields, though Edward Collier had recently invested in an experimental sugar operation, convinced he could compete with the Louisiana estates despite warnings from neighboring planters. 87 people lived and worked on the property, their lives dictated by the rhythms of cultivation and harvest, by the temperaments of the Collier family, by the brutal mathematics of profit and loss that reduced human beings to ledger entries. Hannah's position in the kitchen afforded her certain protections. She was too valuable to risk in the fields, too skilled to replace easily. The Colliers had purchased her at auction in Natchez when she was 14, after the previous cook had died of fever. The auctioneer had emphasized her training under a French-influenced household in New Orleans. Though this was an exaggeration, she had merely worked in the scullery of such a house, learning through observation rather than instruction. But Hannah possessed something more valuable than formal training, an intuitive understanding of flavors, temperatures, and timing that transformed even simple ingredients into dishes that won praise from the Collier's guests. Edward Collier took pride in his table, using elaborate dinners to cultivate relationships with factors, merchants, and politicians whose favor he required. Hannah's abilities served his ambitions, which meant she was fed better than others, allowed to sleep in a small room attached to the kitchen rather than in the quarters, and spared the worst of the physical punishments that punctuated life on the estate. This relative privilege created distance between Hannah and the others. Some resented her perceived advantages. Others understood that her position came with its own dangers, that proximity to the main house meant constant surveillance, that the standards expected of her left no room for human weakness or error. She maintained carefully calibrated relationships with everyone, respectful deference toward the Colliers, professional courtesy with Thomas Barrett, the white overseer who managed the daily operations, distant but not unfriendly interactions with the house servants, practical exchanges with those who worked the gardens and livestock, trading kitchen scraps and occasional favors for the freshest produce and meat, only with Dinah, who worked as seamstress and occasional lady's maid to Mrs. Collier. Did Hannah allow something approaching friendship? They had arrived at Riverside within months of each other, both young and terrified, both learning to navigate a world of unspoken rules and sudden violence. Over the years, they had developed a shorthand communication that required few words, able to convey warnings and reassurances with a glance or the tilt of a head. It was Dinah who first noticed something had changed in the main house. Mrs. Collier requested 3 dresses be let out. Dinah mentioned quietly one evening in late September, standing in the kitchen doorway while Hannah prepared the next day's bread dough. She said she's been retaining water, but Hannah's hands continued their rhythmic kneading, but her attention sharpened. But I heard her being sick this morning. 4th time this week. The 2 women's eyes met. In that silent exchange passed an understanding of what this might mean and what consequences it might bring. Catherine Collier was 32 years old and had been married to Edward for 14 years. In that time she had given birth to 3 children, Margaret, now 12, Edward Jr., 9, and Thomas, who would have been 7, but had died of fever 3 years earlier. The loss of Thomas had devastated Catherine, plunging her into a melancholy that had lasted months, from which she had emerged changed, quieter, more distant, prone to headaches and nervous complaints. If Catherine was pregnant again, it would alter the household's dynamics in ways both obvious and subtle. It might soften Edward's increasingly short temper, giving him hope for another son. It might deepen Catherine's anxiety, given her age and the memory of her loss. It might shift attention away from other matters that had been building tension in the house. Matters like Edward's frequent trips to Charleston and New Orleans, which some whispered had purposes beyond business. Like the gambling debts that Thomas Barrett had mentioned to the house servants, thinking his words wouldn't travel. Like the pressure Edward had been putting on his cotton factors to advance more credit against future harvests, a dangerous practice that had ruined other planters. Hannah had learned to recognize patterns, to sense when instability threatened to erupt into crisis. The Collier household had been moving towards some kind of breaking point for months, like storm clouds gathering on a humid afternoon. A pregnancy might diffuse that tension, or it might accelerate it. She couldn't yet tell which. "I'll make her ginger tea," Hannah said finally, "the kind that settles the stomach." Dinah nodded, understanding this response for what it was. An acknowledgement of the information, a commitment to careful observation, a promise to talk more when circumstances allowed. After Dinah left, Hannah continued working the dough with mechanical precision, while her mind ranged over everything she knew about the household's current state. She had developed the habit of collecting information the way she collected herbs, carefully, systematically, storing each piece away for potential future use, even when she couldn't yet see how it might be applied. She knew that Edward had argued with his brother Charles over money matters during Charles's visit last month. She knew that Margaret had been caught reading abolitionist literature smuggled in by the tutor Edward had hired, causing a scandal that resulted in the tutor's immediate dismissal. She knew that Edward Jr. had developed a cruel streak, tormenting the house cats and once attempting to burn a nest of baby mice alive until Catherine had stopped him. She knew that Thomas Barrett had started drinking more heavily, his morning rounds increasingly erratic. And she knew that over the past 6 months, 3 people on the estate had died under circumstances that, while not impossible, seemed unlikely. The first had been old Samuel, who had been past 70 and suffered from a weak heart. He had collapsed in the fields on a brutally hot day in June. The physician who examined him had declared it apoplexy, entirely expected given Samuel's age and the temperature. The second had been 19-year-old Ruth, who had been pregnant and begun bleeding heavily one night in July. She had died before morning. The same physician had concluded it was a miscarriage gone wrong, a tragedy, but not uncommon. The third had been Jonas, one of the field drivers who worked under Thomas Barrett's supervision. He had complained of severe stomach pain after the midday meal in August, vomited repeatedly, and died that same evening. The physician had suggested food poisoning, perhaps spoiled meat in the heat. 3 deaths in 3 months, on an estate of fewer than 90 people. Perhaps it meant nothing. Death was common enough, claiming young and old without pattern or mercy. But something about the timing bothered Hannah, a dissonance she couldn't quite name. She had cooked the meal that Jonas ate before he died. The pork had been fresh, butchered that morning. The vegetables had come from the garden, no different from what she'd served dozens of times before. She had tasted everything herself before sending it to the fields, as she always did. Nothing had been wrong with that food. So why had Jonas died? The question haunted her through the following days as she went about her routine, rising before dawn to start the kitchen fire, preparing the simple breakfast of cornmeal mush that would be distributed to those working the fields, beginning the more elaborate preparations for the main house meals, the hot breads and preserved fruits and carefully seasoned meats that Edward demanded for his table. She moved through these tasks with the efficiency of long practice, her hands working while her mind wandered through darker territory. She found herself studying the Collier family with new attention during the meals she served, noting details she had previously dismissed as routine household tensions. The way Edward barely looked at Catherine during breakfast, his attention fixed on the newspaper or his account books. The way Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, how she had started wearing gloves even inside the house, as if trying to hide something. The way Margaret watched her parents with an expression Hannah couldn't quite interpret, not childish ignorance but something older, more knowing, almost calculating. And Edward Jr., who had started spending time in the kitchen, ostensibly fascinated by the cooking process, but asking questions that made Hannah uncomfortable. "Do you ever make mistakes?" he had asked one afternoon, watching her chop vegetables with rapid precision. "Put in the wrong ingredient?" "No, Master Edward," Hannah had replied carefully. "I'm very careful with everything I prepare." "But what if you did? What if you mixed up sugar and salt, or used the wrong herb?" "That wouldn't happen, Master Edward. I know every ingredient in this kitchen. Every single one." His eyes had gleamed with something Hannah recognized as dangerous curiosity. "Even the things in Mother's still room, the medicine plants she keeps?" Hannah had set down her knife, giving him her full attention. "I only use what belongs in the kitchen, Master Edward. Your mother's medicines are her concern, not mine." He had seemed disappointed by this answer, lingering a few more minutes before wandering away. But the exchange had left Hannah unsettled, adding another piece to the puzzle she was unconsciously assembling. That evening, after the dinner service had been completed and the main house had settled into lamplight and quiet routine, Hannah made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved the key she wasn't supposed to have, a duplicate she had made years ago by pressing the original into soft wax, then having the blacksmith create a copy in exchange for extra portions and keeping certain things to himself. She unlocked Mrs. Collier's still room. The space was small and organized with meticulous care, shelves lined with bottles and jars labeled in Catherine's careful hand. Lavender for nerves, chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain, digitalis from the foxglove, used in tiny amounts for heart complaints, belladonna for stomach cramps, measured in drops so dilute they were barely present. All the medicines were accounted for, their levels appearing normal for household use. But there, on the bottom shelf, hidden behind larger containers, Hannah found something that made her blood run cold. A jar labeled arsenic for rats, its contents reduced by nearly half since she had last glimpsed it months ago during one of Mrs. Collier's occasional requests for Hannah to fetch something from the room. Arsenic. The rat poison that, in small doses administered over time, could cause symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness. Stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, death. Hannah stood frozen in that still room, holding the jar with trembling hands, understanding with terrible clarity that she had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The knowledge she carried had always been theoretical, defensive, things she knew in order to protect herself from accidental harm. But now she was standing in a locked room, holding evidence of something far more sinister, forced to confront possibilities that turned her stomach even as her mind raced through the implications. Who had been using the arsenic? Who had access to this room besides Catherine? What if the 3 deaths hadn't been coincidental after all? What if someone in the main house had been killing people, and what if they knew that Hannah had figured it out? She replaced the jar exactly as she had found it, locked the still room, and returned to her small room in the kitchen building. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, she lay in darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the estate settling around her, understanding that she now possessed the most dangerous kind of knowledge, truth about murder, without any safe way to speak it. The morning after her discovery, Hannah moved through her duties with exaggerated normalcy, terrified that any deviation from routine might betray what she knew. Her hands prepared food with their usual efficiency, but her mind worked feverishly, examining the past months from this new, terrible perspective. If someone had been using arsenic to kill, they had been clever about it. The deaths had been spaced out, affecting different types of people: an elderly man, a young woman, a strong field hand. Nothing to suggest a pattern to anyone not looking for one. And arsenic, she knew from overheard conversations between Catherine and visiting ladies discussing pest control, was nearly impossible to detect after death. Physicians would see the symptoms and conclude natural causes, never thinking to suspect murder. But who would have motive to kill Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas? What connected 3 people from different parts of the plantation hierarchy? Hannah had learned over the years that information flowed through the estate along invisible channels, carried by those whose presence was so constant they became nearly invisible themselves. House servants heard conversations the Colliers forgot they were having. Field workers observed interactions during the overseer's rounds. Children repeated things without understanding their significance. If Hannah positioned herself carefully at these intersection points, she could map the estate's true dynamics beneath its surface appearance. She started by approaching Marcus, who worked as stable hand, and thus had access to conversations that took place during arrivals and departures, when people's guards were down. "Marcus," she said quietly, catching him as he brought fresh water to the kitchen. "I've been thinking about Jonas. Did he seem troubled before he died? Fighting with anyone?" Marcus paused, his expression becoming guarded. People had learned to be careful when discussing the dead, particularly when their deaths might reflect poorly on the estate's management. But he and Hannah had known each other for years, long enough that he trusted her not to use information carelessly. "Not fighting exactly," he said slowly. But he'd been complaining to Thomas Barrett about the field assignments, thought Barrett was playing favorites, giving easier work to some while running others harder. Did Barrett change anything after Jonas complained? Made it worse, gave Jonas the worst sections, the land with most stumps to clear. It was like he was punishing him. Marcus's face tightened. But Jonas was strong, could handle hard work. What he couldn't handle was... He trailed off, glancing toward the main house. "What?" Hannah pressed. "There were rumors," Marcus said finally, his voice dropping even lower, "about Jonas and one of the house girls. About them being caught together somewhere they shouldn't have been. About Mr. Collier being furious. The implication hung heavy between them. Such situations rarely ended well for those involved. If Edward had discovered a liaison between Jonas and one of the house servants, particularly if it had been consensual, it would have been seen as theft. Theft of his property's time and reproductive potential. The usual response would be swift and public punishment, meant to discourage others. But there had been no public punishment. Jonas had simply died, suddenly and painfully, his death attributed to bad meat. "Which house girl?" Hannah asked. Marcus shook his head. "Don't know if it was true. Just rumors." But the next day, Hannah noticed something she had missed before. 16-year-old Lily, who worked primarily as Catherine's personal maid, had been given additional outdoor duties, working in the vegetable garden, hauling water, tasks that kept her visible and supervised rather than inside the house where private moments might be possible. It was the kind of reassignment that looked like normal work distribution, but functioned as punishment and control. Hannah found Lily alone in the garden late one afternoon, using the pretense of selecting herbs for that evening's meal to position herself nearby. She said nothing at first, simply working in parallel, allowing her presence to become comfortable before attempting conversation. Finally, Lily spoke first. "You knew Jonas?" It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded, continuing to examine mint leaves. "Did he say anything to you?" Lily's voice was barely audible. "Before he died?" "No," Hannah said truthfully, "but I remember him as a good person. Someone who tried to do right by others." Lily's hands stilled in the dirt. She paused, wrestling with something. "We were going to run. He had been saving money from selling carved wood pieces to some of the hands. Had almost enough to buy supplies. We were going to try for Ohio, had heard about a route through Tennessee." Hannah's chest tightened. The escape attempt would have been nearly impossible, discovered within days, and punished with savage certainty. But she understood the desperation that drove such plans, the calculation that even slim chances of freedom might be worth risking everything. "When were you planning to go?" "August. Right after the lay-by, when everyone's exhausted and discipline gets looser." Lily's voice wavered. "Then Jonas got sick. Died so fast, and You think it wasn't natural?" Hannah finished quietly. Lily's silence was answer enough. Hannah returned to the kitchen with her herbs and a deepening sense of dread. If Jonas had been killed to prevent an escape attempt, it suggested that someone had known about the plan. But how? Had Jonas confided in the wrong person? Had he and Lily been overheard during one of their clandestine meetings? That night, she questioned Dinah about Jonas and Lily, choosing her words carefully. "I saw Lily crying in the garden today," Hannah said while Dinah helped clean after dinner. "She's still grieving Jonas." Dinah glanced toward the main house before responding. "Mrs. Collier mentioned something about it to Mr. Collier last month. I was adjusting her dress when he came into the room. She said she'd seen Lily slipping out at odd hours, thought maybe she was meeting someone. Asked him to look into it." "What did he say?" "That he would handle it." Dinah's expression was troubled. This was maybe 2 days before Jonas died. The timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. If Edward had discovered the relationship and the escape plan, Jonas's death made terrible sense. Not as punishment, but as prevention, disguised as natural illness to avoid the questions and attention that a public execution might bring from neighbors or authorities. But this still left the other 2 deaths unexplained. What had Samuel and Ruth done to merit murder? Or were they killed for different reasons entirely? Hannah spent the following week in a state of hypervigilance, observing everything while trying to appear normally occupied. She noticed that Catherine had indeed stopped vomiting in the mornings, confirming the pregnancy. Edward's mood had improved slightly, though he still spent long hours in his study, reviewing account books with expressions that suggested the numbers weren't cooperating with his wishes. Margaret had become more withdrawn, spending hours in her room reading when she wasn't helping Catherine with household management tasks. Edward Jr. continued his disturbing interests, recently fascinated by the butchering process, and asking Hannah detailed questions about anatomy that she deflected with vague non-answers. And Thomas Barrett had started appearing at the kitchen door more frequently, sometimes asking for coffee, sometimes just standing there watching Hannah work with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're a clever woman," he said one afternoon, startling her. She hadn't heard him approach. very attentive to details. Hannah kept her focus on the vegetables she was preparing. "Just trying to do my work properly, Mr. Barrett." "I'm sure you are." He didn't move from the doorway. "Noticed you've been asking questions lately. About Jonas, about others. Curiosity?" Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "Just trying to understand what happened. Jonas ate food I prepared. When someone dies after eating my cooking, I need to know it wasn't something I did wrong. The physician said it was spoiled meat. The meat wasn't spoiled. I checked it carefully like I always do." Barrett was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe he ate something else. Something not from your kitchen." Hannah finally looked up, meeting his eyes. What she saw there made her blood run cold. A kind of calculation, an assessment of threat level, a decision being made in real time about how much danger she represented. "Maybe," she agreed carefully, returning to her work. Barrett lingered another moment before leaving, but Hannah knew the conversation had been a warning disguised as casual inquiry. She was being watched. Her questions had been noticed. She needed to be more careful, or become the next convenient death. That evening, she finally sought out Josiah, the oldest person on the estate at 73. He had been at Riverside longer than anyone, purchased by Edward's father 40 years ago, and his age had earned him a kind of informal historian status. People went to Josiah when they needed to understand the estate's deeper patterns, its unspoken rules, its dangerous currents. She found him sitting outside his cabin, carving a piece of wood into a bird shape, the same craft Jonas had learned from him. "Hannah," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Don't often see you away from the kitchen after dark." "Had to stretch my legs." She settled onto a nearby stump, watching his gnarled hands work the wood with surprising deftness. "Josiah, can I ask you something?" "Can't promise I'll answer, but you can ask. Have people died strangely on this estate before? Deaths that seemed wrong somehow?" His hands stilled. "That's a dangerous question. I know, but I need to understand." Josiah was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, he resumed carving, his words coming measured and careful. "Mr. Collier's father, the old master, he ran this place different. Firm but consistent. You knew where you stood. When he died 8 years back, young Edward inherited. Things changed. How? Edward's got ambitions bigger than his means. Wants to be one of the great planters, wants political influence, wants respect from men who see him as small time. That kind of wanting makes a man take risks. And when risks don't pay off, makes him desperate. What kind of risks? Expansion he couldn't afford. That sugar operation, it's bleeding money. The cotton market's been uncertain. He's borrowed against future harvests, made promises to factors he might not be able to keep. Josiah's knife peeled another thin curl of wood. Desperate men do desperate things. You think the deaths are connected to his financial problems? Didn't say that. Said desperate men do desperate things. He finally looked at her directly. But I'll tell you this. Samuel was the only one left who remembered when Mr. Collier's father wrote his will, and that will had some provisions about what would happen if Edward couldn't maintain the estate properly. Hannah's breath caught. What provisions? Don't know exactly. But I know Edward had been asking Samuel questions about it last year, and Samuel, he had a memory like a vault. Could recite conversations from decades past, word for word. What about Ruth? Ruth worked in the house for a while before she got pregnant, worked directly under Mrs. Collier, helping with household accounts. She was good with numbers, could read and cipher better than most. Mrs. Collier trusted her with private matters. The pieces were assembling into a pattern that made Hannah's skin prickle. Samuel, who knew about inheritance provisions. Ruth, who had access to financial information. Jonas, who was planning to escape with Lily, who served as Catherine's personal maid and would have been privy to intimate household secrets. 3 people who knew things. 3 people who died suddenly of causes that could be explained away as natural or accidental. Josiah, Hannah said slowly, if someone wanted to kill people quietly on an estate like this, how would they do it? His hands stopped moving again. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning. A smart person wouldn't ask questions like that. A smart person would keep their head down and their mouth shut. But if they had to ask, he set down his carving, meeting her eyes with an intensity that seemed to look straight through her. Then I'd say that person had better be very sure they could protect themselves, because once you start pulling on threads like these, either you pull the whole thing apart or it wraps around your neck. I'm already in it, Josiah. I just need to understand how deep. He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Poison's the easiest. Doesn't leave marks, can mimic natural illness if done right. Problem is getting access to it and knowing how to use it without getting caught. Who would have that access? Mrs. Collier keeps all the medicines and rat poison locked in her still room. Only she has the key. He paused significantly. Far as anyone knows. Hannah felt the weight of her stolen key in her pocket, as if it had suddenly become burning metal. And who would know how to use them properly? Someone educated. Someone who'd been taught about herbs and medicines. Someone like Mrs. Collier, who came from a family that prided itself on household medicine knowledge. The implications struck Hannah like cold water. She had been assuming Edward was behind the deaths, but what if it was Catherine? What if the mistress of the house, with her medicines and her melancholy and her trembling hands, was systematically removing threats to the household's stability? But that raised new questions. Why would Catherine kill Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas? What threat did they pose to her? Unless she was protecting Edward. Unless she knew about his financial desperation, his secrets, his vulnerabilities, and was eliminating anyone who might expose him or complicate his efforts to solve his problems. Or unless Catherine had her own secrets, her own desperate need for control in a life where she had so little power. Hannah thanked Josiah and made her way back to the kitchen, her mind spinning with possibilities. She had entered this investigation thinking she was looking for a single poisoner with clear motives. Instead, she was uncovering a web of secrets, financial pressure, and multiple people with access and potential reasons to kill. And she was running out of time to stay invisible. Thomas Barrett's warning had been clear. Someone knew she was asking questions. Someone was watching her. If she didn't figure out who was behind the deaths soon, she might become the fourth victim. The next morning brought new complications. Catherine requested Hannah's presence in the main house, an unusual summons that immediately set every nerve on edge. Hannah found Catherine in the small sitting room she used for morning correspondence, sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap. She looked pale and tired, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she wasn't sleeping well. "Hannah," Catherine said without preamble, "I need to discuss something delicate with you." "Yes, ma'am." "I've been hearing reports that you've been asking questions about certain unfortunate events on the estate. The deaths of Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas." Hannah's mouth went dry, but she kept her expression neutral. "I was concerned, ma'am. Jonas died after eating a meal I prepared. I wanted to make sure there wasn't something wrong with my cooking. The physician confirmed it was spoiled meat, not your preparation." "Yes, ma'am. But the meat wasn't spoiled when I cooked it. I was worried there might be something else I missed." Catherine studied her with eyes that seemed to see more than Hannah was comfortable with. "Your dedication to your responsibilities is noted. However, I need you to understand that asking questions about such matters can cause unnecessary distress. People talk, rumors spread, and the last thing this household needs is speculation about improper circumstances. I understand, Ma'am." "Do you?" Catherine's voice sharpened slightly. "Because I'm not sure you understand your position here, Hannah. You're very good at your work. The meals you prepare are excellent, and you've served this family well for many years. But that service depends on discretion, on knowing what questions to ask and which ones to leave unspoken." It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, unmistakable in its intent. "I understand completely, ma'am," Hannah said quietly. "I won't ask any more questions." "Good." Catherine's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained hard. "I'm glad we understand each other. You may return to your duties." Hannah left the sitting room with her heart pounding so hard she thought Catherine must have heard it. The message had been clear: stop investigating or face consequences. But the very fact that Catherine had felt the need to deliver that warning personally suggested Hannah had touched something important, something dangerous enough to warrant direct intervention. She had two choices now. She could obey Catherine's warning, stop asking questions, and hope that whoever was killing people didn't decide she knew too much to live. Or she could continue investigating, more carefully this time, and try to protect herself by gathering enough evidence that her death would raise uncomfortable questions. Neither option was safe, but one left her completely vulnerable to someone else's choices, while the other gave her at least the illusion of agency. Hannah chose the second option, knowing it might kill her. The days following Catherine's warning were among the most difficult of Hannah's life. She maintained absolute normalcy in her visible behavior, executing her kitchen duties with mechanical perfection, while her mind worked constantly on the impossible problem of how to protect herself from an enemy she couldn't openly acknowledge. She needed evidence, but couldn't risk being caught gathering it. She needed allies, but couldn't trust anyone completely, not when the killer might be Catherine, Edward, Barrett, or someone else entirely who might inform on her for favor or safety. So she worked with what she had: observation, patience, and knowledge of the plantation's rhythms that came from 23 years of paying attention. She watched Catherine carefully during meal services, noting that the mistress had started taking her meals in her room more frequently, citing morning sickness and fatigue. But Hannah noticed other details. The way Catherine's hands had stopped trembling, suggesting either the pregnancy was stabilizing her nerves or something else had changed. The way she had started spending more time in the garden, particularly near the medicinal plants. She watched Edward, who had become increasingly irritable, snapping at his children and house servants over minor infractions. His study sessions with account books stretched later into the night, and she twice saw Thomas Barrett leaving the study looking troubled after extended private conversations. She watched Edward Jr., whose fascination with death had progressed from questions to actions. He had killed a cat. Everyone knew, though no one spoke of it, claiming it had attacked him, though the animal had been too mutilated for that explanation to hold credibility. Margaret had found the body and reported it to Catherine with trembling hands. But Catherine had merely instructed the boy to be more careful and said nothing to Edward. And she watched Thomas Barrett, who had developed an unsettling habit of appearing wherever Hannah was working, never quite approaching her directly, but always present, always watching, like a hunter positioning himself for an eventual strike. But her most important observation came 2 weeks after Catherine's warning, when Hannah noticed something that changed her entire understanding of the situation. She was preparing vegetables early one morning when Lily came to the kitchen door, sent by Catherine to request a specific herbal tea blend for her nausea. As Hannah prepared the mixture, she noticed how thin Lily had become, how the girl's hands shook slightly as she accepted the teapot. "Are you well, Lily?" Hannah asked quietly. The girl's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "I'm fine, Miss Hannah." "You don't look fine." Lily glanced over her shoulder, verifying they were alone. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "I can't say, but if something happens to me, you should know." She stopped abruptly as footsteps sounded from the main house. "I have to go." She left before Hannah could press further, but the exchange haunted Hannah through the day. Lily was frightened of something specific, something immediate, and she had wanted Hannah to know something, but had been interrupted before she could share it. That night, Hannah made a decision that crossed another line. She would enter the main house after everyone was asleep and search for information that might explain what was happening. It was spectacularly risky. If discovered, she could be whipped, sold, or worse. But she was convinced that understanding the Collier's secrets was the only way to protect herself from becoming their next victim. She waited until well past midnight, when even Edward's lamp had been extinguished. Then, using her stolen key, She entered through the kitchen door and moved silently through the house's ground floor. She had been in these rooms thousands of times while serving meals, but experiencing them at night without legitimate purpose transformed them into foreign territory. Every creak of wood, every settling sound sent her pulse racing. She started with Edward's study, carefully searching through papers on his desk by the dim light of a shielded candle. What she found confirmed Josiah's warnings. Edward was in severe financial trouble. Letters from factors demanding payment. Notes from his bank threatening to call in loans. Calculations showing that even a good cotton harvest wouldn't cover his obligations. But it was a letter tucked into a private drawer that made everything crystallize. The letter was from Charles Collier, Edward's brother, and it was dated 3 months before Samuel's death. In it, Charles reminded Edward of a provision in their father's will. If Edward could not maintain the estate profitably for 5 years after their father's death, ownership would transfer to Charles, with Edward receiving only a small annuity. The 5-year mark had been reached this past April. Charles had sent someone to audit the estate's financial condition, and that someone had apparently talked to Samuel, who could verify that Edward had been hiding losses, inflating harvest numbers, and borrowing against inflated collateral. Samuel had died in June. Hannah stood frozen in the study, holding the letter with shaking hands. Edward had killed Samuel, or had him killed, to protect his ownership of Riverside. Which meant Ruth and Jonas must have stumbled onto evidence of either Samuel's murder or Edward's financial deception. The sound of footsteps in the hall above sent Hannah diving behind Edward's desk, blowing out her candle and pressing herself into the shadow. She held her breath as the footsteps descended the stairs, moved through the lower hall and entered the kitchen. Whoever it was stayed there for several minutes. Hannah could hear the sounds of cabinet doors opening and closing, glass clinking, water being poured. Then the footsteps returned, climbing back upstairs. Hannah waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place. She returned Edward's papers to their original positions, checking twice to ensure nothing appeared disturbed. Then she slipped back through the kitchen door and returned to her room, her mind racing with implications. She had found motive. Edward was killing to protect his inheritance. But she still didn't know how he was accessing the arsenic, unless he had a copy of Catherine's still-room key as well. Or unless Catherine was complicit, helping him remove threats to their family's security. The next morning, Hannah was preparing breakfast when she heard screaming from the main house. Her first thought was that someone had discovered her nighttime intrusion. Her second thought was that something had happened to one of the Colliers. Both possibilities sent terror through her as she abandoned the kitchen and ran toward the main house. She found chaos in the front hall. Catherine was standing at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, her face white and her mouth open in a continuing scream. Edward was running up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The house servants were converging from different directions, confusion and fear on their faces. "What happened?" Hannah demanded of Dinah, who stood frozen in a doorway. "It's Miss Margaret," Dinah whispered. "She's sick, really sick." Hannah's blood turned to ice. She pushed past the gathering servants and ran up the stairs, knowing she had no business being there but needing to see, to understand. Margaret's room door was open. Inside, Hannah could see the 12-year-old girl lying on her bed, her face grey and covered in sweat, a basin on the floor beside her showing evidence of violent vomiting. Edward was shouting for someone to fetch the physician. Catherine had stopped screaming but was sobbing, clutching the doorframe as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. And Hannah, standing in the hallway, knew with terrible certainty exactly what had happened. She had heard someone in the kitchen last night. Someone had been preparing something to eat or drink. Margaret, who often came down for a glass of milk when she couldn't sleep, must have consumed whatever had been prepared. Whatever had been poisoned. But poisoned by whom? Had Edward accidentally poisoned his own daughter while preparing something meant for someone else? Had Catherine done it deliberately, her mind fractured by stress and pregnancy hormones? Had Margaret's illness been the horrible result of a dose meant for different target? Or, and this thought made Hannah's skin crawl, had Margaret been the intended victim all along, killed by someone for reasons Hannah hadn't yet uncovered? The physician arrived within the hour, examining Margaret with growing concern. Hannah, who had been ordered back to the kitchen but was lurking nearby, overheard fragments of his conversation with Edward. Symptoms consistent with toxic ingestion. Need to empty her stomach completely. May already be too late. Margaret died that afternoon, never regaining consciousness. The estate plunged into mourning. But underneath the grief, Hannah sensed something else. Fear. The Colliers knew this hadn't been a natural death. They might not understand the full scope of what was happening, but they knew their daughter had been murdered. And the murderer was still here, still killing, still dangerous. In the week following Margaret's death, the Riverside estate transformed into a place of suffocating suspicion. Edward interrogated the house servants with barely controlled rage, demanding to know who had been in the kitchen that night, who had prepared food or drink, who had seen or heard anything unusual. No one admitted to being in the kitchen. No one had seen or heard anything. The fear of being blamed for Margaret's death was stronger than any compulsion to provide information. Hannah maintained absolute silence about her own nighttime activities, knowing that admitting she had been in the main house would make her the primary suspect, regardless of actual guilt. She had touched nothing in the kitchen, had only hidden in the study and read letters. But no one would believe that, and the punishment for a slave entering the main house without permission was severe, even without an associated death. Catherine had collapsed completely after Margaret's funeral, taking to her bed and refusing to see anyone except the physician, who prescribed rest and laudanum for her nerves. Edward, meanwhile, had descended into a paranoid fury, convinced that someone on the estate was deliberately targeting his family. He was right, of course, but Hannah was beginning to suspect his understanding of the situation was incomplete in crucial ways. Thomas Barrett had increased patrols around the main house, instituting new restrictions on movement after dark, questioning anyone whose routine deviated even slightly from established patterns. Hannah felt his attention on her constantly, a weight of suspicion she couldn't shake. But it was Edward Jr.'s reaction that disturbed her most. The 9-year-old had not cried at his sister's funeral. He had not shown appropriate grief. Instead, he had watched the proceedings with an expression of intense interest, studying the mourners, the casket, the rituals of death, with the same fascinated attention he gave to dissection and violence. And twice, Hannah had caught him watching her with an unnerving smile. 4 days after the funeral, Lily failed to appear for her morning duties. When Catherine, emerging from her seclusion, sent someone to fetch her, they found Lily unconscious in the servants' quarters, barely breathing. The physician was summoned again. He examined Lily, smelled her breath, checked her pulse, and delivered his diagnosis with grim certainty. Poison. Same as the Collier girl. This time, Edward's rage found a target. He ordered Lily's small room searched, and Thomas Barrett discovered, hidden beneath her mattress, a small vial of arsenic taken from Catherine's still room. She confessed before she lost consciousness, Barrett announced to the assembled household, his face hard. Said she'd been planning to escape and wanted to take revenge on the family for Jonas's death. Poisoned Miss Margaret, thinking she was getting back at the master. Then tried to kill herself when she realized what she'd done. The story was convenient. Too convenient. Hannah knew immediately that it was fabricated, that Lily had been framed, that the real killer was using her as a scapegoat to end the investigation. But what could Hannah say? If she challenged Barrett's narrative, she would have to explain how she knew it was false, which would mean revealing her own investigation, her stolen key, her understanding of the killings. She would be condemning herself to save a girl who was already dying. Lily never regained consciousness. She died that evening, and Barrett ordered her body buried immediately in the estate cemetery's far corner. the area reserved for those who had died in disgrace. At the burial, Hannah stood at a distance, watching them lower Lily's body into the ground, feeling the weight of her own cowardice like stones in her chest. She had known Lily was in danger. The girl had tried to warn her that something might happen, and Hannah had done nothing because saving Lily would have required sacrificing herself. But as earth was shoveled onto Lily's grave, Hannah made a decision. She would not let this stand. She would not allow the real killer to escape justice by using a dead 16-year-old as a scapegoat. Even if it destroyed her, she would find a way to expose the truth. She started by revisiting everything she knew, examining it from new angles. If Lily had been framed, someone had planted that arsenic vial in her room. Who had access? Barrett, certainly. He had conducted the search. But he would have needed the arsenic first, which meant access to Catherine's still room. Hannah returned to that locked room late one night, her heart pounding with each step. The still room was exactly as she'd seen it before, except for one crucial detail. The arsenic jar was now empty. All of it had been used or removed. She stood there in the darkness, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The killer had used up all the arsenic, first on Samuel, Ruth, and Jonas, then on Margaret, and finally framing Lily. There was no more poison to trace, no more evidence to find, unless Hannah could prove that someone had access to the still room beyond Catherine. She examined the room more carefully, looking for any sign that others had been there. And finally, pressed into the soft wood of the door frame at child height, she found something, a small carved initial. E.J., Edward Jr. The boy had been in the still room. He had carved his initial into the wood the way children do, marking territory, claiming ownership of forbidden spaces. Hannah thought back to all his disturbing behaviors, his questions about cooking mistakes and medicine plants, his fascination with death and suffering, his strange lack of grief after Margaret's death. What if the killer wasn't Edward or Catherine or Barrett? What if it was a 9-year-old boy who had somehow gained access to his mother's medicines and was killing for reasons an adult mind couldn't comprehend? The idea seemed impossible. Children didn't commit systematic murder. Except Hannah remembered stories traded among the slaves on neighboring estates, whispered accounts of disturbed children who hurt animals, siblings, even themselves. She remembered one cook describing a planter's son who had poisoned his own family because he'd been punished for something minor, his child mind unable to process consequences beyond immediate revenge. What if Edward Jr. had killed Samuel for some slight Hannah didn't know about? What if he'd killed Ruth because she'd reported some misbehavior to his parents? What if Jonas had caught him doing something inappropriate and threatened to tell? And Margaret, his own sister, had she discovered his secrets? Had she threatened to expose him? The pattern fit. A child would kill without the careful planning of an adult, would choose victims based on immediate emotional responses rather than strategic necessity. A child with access to the still room, perhaps stealing his mother's key or having a copy made, could poison people without the systematic caution an adult would employ. But proving it was another matter. No one would believe the word of a slave over a white child, particularly a child of the estate's owners. If Hannah accused Edward Jr. without absolute proof, she would be executed for slander, probably tortured first to confess to being the real killer. She needed evidence so overwhelming that even Edward couldn't ignore it. The opportunity came 3 days later when Edward Jr. approached her in the kitchen, watching her work with his usual unsettling intensity. "You knew Lily was going to die," he said conversationally. Hannah's hands stuttered in their rhythm before she caught herself. "I didn't know anything of the sort, Master Edward." "Yes, you did, I could tell. You weren't surprised when they found her sick." "I was very surprised and very sad." "No, you weren't." He moved closer, his child's face wearing an expression far too knowing. "You know lots of things. You know about poisons and medicines. You know which plants are dangerous." Hannah set down her knife carefully, giving him her full attention. "Your mother knows much more about those things than I do, Master Edward." Mother's asleep most of the time now. She doesn't pay attention, but you pay attention to everything." He smiled. "That's why you're still alive." The threat was unmistakable despite his casual tone. Hannah felt ice running through her veins but kept her expression neutral. "I just try to do my work properly, Master Edward. I think you do more than that. I think you understand exactly what's been happening." He tilted his head, studying her like a predator assessing prey. "But you can't tell anyone, can you? Because they'd never believe you. They'd think you were lying to save yourself." He was 9 years old and understood the dynamics of power and credibility with terrifying clarity. "I don't know what you mean, Master Edward." "Yes, you do. But it's all right. I won't hurt you. You're too useful. Besides, it's more interesting having someone who knows, like a game." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Margaret was going to tell Father about the cat. She said I was sick, that I needed to be sent away to a school that could fix me. I couldn't let her do that. Hannah's breath caught. He had just confessed to murdering his sister, said it as casually as if commenting on the weather, secure in the knowledge that Hannah's word against his would mean her death, not his. "Why are you telling me this?" Hannah asked quietly. Edward Jr.'s smile widened. "Because you already knew, and because I want someone to understand how clever I've been. Adults think children are stupid, but we're not. We just have to be more careful." "What about the others? Samuel, Ruth, Jonas?" Samuel was boring and talked too much about things that weren't his business. "Ruth caught me in Mother's still room and threatened to tell. Jonas—" He paused, thinking. "Jonas was just practice. I wanted to see if I could do it in the fields, make it look like bad food from your kitchen. It worked perfectly." Hannah felt sick listening to this recitation of murder delivered in a child's voice. And Lily? She was convenient. Everyone already suspected her because of Jonas. It was easy to put Mother's key under her mattress with the empty arsenic bottle and tell Mr. Barrett that I'd seen her acting suspicious. "Did Barrett know what you were doing?" "Of course not. None of them know. They're all too busy suspecting each other." He laughed, a sound that belonged to no child Hannah had ever known. "Father thinks Mother might have done it. Mother thinks Father is capable of anything. Barrett thinks they're both involved. It's entertaining watching them." He left then, leaving Hannah standing in the kitchen with trembling hands, finally understanding the full horror of her situation. She had discovered the killer, had heard his confession, and was now more trapped than ever. She couldn't report him without condemning herself. She couldn't kill him without the same result. She couldn't escape. Where would she run, and who would protect her from the law's inevitable pursuit? She was trapped in a house with a child murderer who had confessed to her specifically because he knew she was powerless to stop him. That night, Hannah lay awake in her room, turning the problem over from every angle. She had promised herself she would expose the truth even if it destroyed her. But now she faced a truth so unthinkable that speaking it would accomplish nothing except her own execution. What would Josiah do? What would someone with more experience navigating impossible situations choose? The answer came to her slowly, built from pieces of conversations, observations, and hard-won wisdom about surviving in a world designed to destroy people like her. She couldn't expose Edward Jr. directly, but she might be able to protect future victims and create circumstances that would eventually reveal the truth without requiring her testimony. The next morning, Hannah began implementing a plan that required patience, precision, and tremendous faith that she hadn't misjudged the remaining decent people at Riverside Estate. She started with the still room. Using her key for what she promised herself would be the last time, she entered that small space and systematically contaminated every remaining poisonous substance. She added ingredients that would cause obvious immediate illness if ingested, violent vomiting, distinctive rashes, symptoms so dramatic that they couldn't be mistaken for natural illness and would require physician intervention. She did this carefully, ensuring that anyone consuming even small amounts would become sick quickly, but not fatally. If Edward Jr. tried to kill again using Catherine's medicines, the attempt would fail spectacularly and draw immediate attention to the still room and its accessibility. Next, she approached Josiah, choosing her words with extraordinary care. "I need advice," she said, sitting beside him outside his cabin on a Sunday afternoon when others were occupied with rest or prayer. If someone knew about wrongdoing but couldn't speak of it without condemning themselves, what should they do? Josiah's carving knife paused. "That's an even more dangerous question than the last one you asked me." "I know, but I'm out of options." He studied her for a long moment. "Does this wrongdoing put others in immediate danger?" "It might. I'm trying to prevent it." "Can you do that without exposing yourself?" "I'm trying, but I need someone to know certain things just in case. Not specific accusations, just directions to look if something happens to me." Josiah set down his carving. "Tell me what you need me to know." Hannah spoke for nearly an hour, laying out a careful narrative of facts without direct accusations. She described the pattern of deaths, the missing arsenic, the access to the still room, the carved initial she'd found. She never mentioned Edward Jr. by name, but she provided enough information that an intelligent person examining the situation would eventually reach the right conclusion. "If I die suddenly," she finished, "I need someone to tell Edward Collier's brother Charles about all of this. Write it down if you can. Send it somehow. Charles wanted someone to investigate Edward's management of the estate. If he learns about these deaths, the circumstances, the evidence of poison, he'll have grounds to challenge Edward's ownership even more strongly. He'll hire proper investigators, people who can ask questions I can't. And if they investigate, they'll eventually realize the truth," Josiah said slowly. "Even without your testimony. That's what I'm hoping. You're taking a terrible risk. If anyone discovers what you've done to those medicines, I know, but I can't let it continue. I can't watch more people die while staying silent because I'm afraid." Josiah reached out and placed his weathered hand over hers, a gesture of solidarity so rare and precious that Hannah felt tears threaten. "I'll remember everything you've told me, and I'll make sure Charles Collier learns of it if needed. You have my word." "Thank you." He squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. "Hannah, be careful. Whatever you're planning, be very careful." She returned to her kitchen and resumed her duties, outwardly unchanged but carrying a small measure of comfort that someone knew, someone would act if she was killed, someone would eventually ensure justice, even if she didn't survive to see it. 3 days later, Edward Jr. appeared at the kitchen door again. "I need you to make me something," he said with his disturbing smile. "A special tea. Mother's complained that the one she makes herself isn't helping her morning sickness anymore. I want to give her something that will make her feel better." Hannah's blood ran cold. Catherine was his next target. Perhaps she had discovered something. Perhaps she had started questioning him. Perhaps he simply wanted to see if he could kill his own mother. "I'm sure your mother's physician can prescribe something appropriate," Hannah said carefully. "I want to make it myself, as a gift. You just need to tell me which herbs to use." "I couldn't possibly advise on medicine for your mother, Master Edward. That's beyond my knowledge." His expression hardened. "Don't lie to me. You know every plant on this estate, what they do, how to use them. Everyone says so. People exaggerate." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Make me the tea, or I'll tell Father you've been entering the main house at night, stealing things. I'll tell him I saw you in his study going through his papers." The threat was brilliant and devastating. Hannah had thought herself clever by leaving no evidence of her nighttime intrusion, but she hadn't accounted for the possibility that someone, this child monster, had seen her, had been watching, had held that information in reserve for exactly this kind of leverage. If he made that accusation, Edward would search her room. He would find the stolen key. He would assume she had been responsible for all the deaths, that she had been gathering information to blackmail him. She would be executed within days. "I saw you," Edward Jr. continued, reading her expression. "I was in Margaret's room that night. I saw you go into Father's study. I watched you read his letters. I know you know things. Hannah felt the walls closing in, the trap tightening around her with mechanical inevitability. She could refuse and be exposed. She could comply and help him kill Catherine. Neither choice was survivable. But perhaps there was a third option. "I'll make the tea," she said slowly, "but I'll need to gather fresh herbs from the garden. It will take me a little while." His smile returned. "That's fine. I'll wait here." Hannah left the kitchen, moving toward the garden with forced calm despite the panic screaming through her mind. She needed to do something, but what? If she ran, they would catch her. If she called for help, Edward Jr. would make his accusations. If she made the tea with harmful herbs, he might test it on someone else first, or she might be blamed for the poisoning regardless. She reached the garden and knelt beside the herbs, her hands shaking as she picked chamomile, mint, and lavender, all harmless, all appropriate for nausea. But as she worked, she noticed someone standing near the garden's edge watching her. Thomas Barrett. Their eyes met, and Hannah made a decision born of absolute desperation. She stood, walked directly to him, and spoke before fear could stop her. "Mr. Barrett, I need to tell you something. Master Edward Jr. asked me to make a medicinal tea for Mrs. Collier. I think he means to poison her." Barrett's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "That's a serious accusation." "I know, sir, but I think he's been responsible for all the deaths. I think he's been using his mother's medicines to kill people, and now he's planning to kill her." She could see him calculating, assessing her credibility against the impossibility of what she was claiming. A 9-year-old child, a serial killer, testimony from a slave. Every element argued against believing her. "I found his initial carved into the still room door frame," Hannah continued desperately. "He's been accessing his mother's medicines. He told me things about the deaths, things only the killer would know. Please, Mr. Barrett, I know you have no reason to trust me, but Mrs. Collier's life is in danger right now." Barrett was silent for a long moment. Then, "Wait here." He strode toward the main house, disappearing inside. Hannah remained frozen in the garden, herbs clutched in her hands, unsure whether she had just saved Catherine's life or signed her own death warrant. 20 minutes later, Barrett emerged from the house with Edward Collier. The two men walked directly to the kitchen, where Edward Jr. was still waiting. Hannah, watching from the garden, saw the boy's expression change from confidence to alarm as his father entered and began speaking to him in tones too low to carry. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then Edward emerged, his face grey, and went back into the main house. Barrett followed. Edward Jr., looking furious, was escorted away by one of the house servants. Hannah waited, hardly breathing, until Dinah came running to the garden. "Hannah, Mr. Barrett wants to see you in the main house. He says you need to explain everything." Hannah followed Dinah back, each step feeling like walking toward execution or salvation. She couldn't tell which. She found Barrett and Edward in the study, along with the physician who had been treating Catherine. "Hannah," Barrett said formally, "tell us everything you told me about Master Edward Jr. and the deaths on this estate." So Hannah told them. Not everything. She didn't mention her stolen key or her nighttime exploration of Edward's papers, but she described the pattern of deaths, the missing arsenic, the carved initial, the child's disturbing behaviors, his questions about poisons, and finally his confession to her and his demand that she help him poison Catherine. Edward listened with an expression that progressed from furious disbelief to horrified comprehension. When Hannah finished, he turned to the physician. Could a child do such things? The physician, an older man who had practiced in the region for decades, nodded slowly. "I've read medical literature about disturbed youth, cases of children who harm others without apparent conscience. It's rare but documented, and the pattern Miss Hannah describes would fit. The victims seemed random to us because we were looking for adult logic, financial motive, revenge, passion. But a child's reasons are different, more immediate, more emotionally driven." "Why didn't anyone suspect Edward Jr. before?" Edward demanded. "Because we're conditioned not to. the physician said gently. We don't want to believe children capable of such evil. And a clever child, understanding that adults won't suspect him, can act with shocking boldness. Edward stood and paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. Hannah could see him struggling with the horror of what he was learning. The implications for his family, the death of his daughter at his son's hands. Finally, he turned back to Hannah. Why didn't you come forward sooner? This was the dangerous question, the one that could still condemn her. Hannah chose her words carefully. Sir, I didn't understand what was happening until recently, and when I began to suspect, I had no proof. I knew that accusing anyone without evidence would result in my punishment, not theirs. I tried to gather information quietly, but I was warned against asking questions. When Master Edward Jr. confessed to me, I knew I couldn't report it without evidence because my word alone would mean nothing. I was trying to find a way to protect people without condemning myself. It was close enough to the truth, omitting only her illegal activities, her extensive investigation, her manipulation of the medicines in the still room. Edward studied her with an expression she couldn't read. You've known my son was a murderer, and you said nothing. I had no safe way to speak, sir, until today when he tried to use me to kill Mrs. Collier, and I had no choice but to tell Mr. Barrett, even though I knew it might result in my own punishment. You should have told me immediately when you first suspected. Yes, sir. Hannah lowered her eyes, accepting the rebuke because arguing would be suicide. Barrett spoke up. She came to me at considerable personal risk, Mr. Collier. Under the circumstances, I believe she did what she could within the impossible constraints of her position. Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict Barrett. Instead, he turned to the physician. What do we do about Edward Jr.? There are institutions, the physician said carefully, places that specialize in treating troubled youth. He needs to be removed from this environment immediately, both for his sake and for the safety of everyone here. If what Hannah says is true, and I believe it is, then your son is extremely dangerous. He will kill again if given opportunity. Edward's face twisted with pain, but he nodded. Make the arrangements. I want him sent away within the week, somewhere far from here where he can be monitored constantly. And the deaths? Barrett asked. Do we report what happened to the authorities? Edward was quiet for a long moment, and Hannah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Reporting the truth would mean scandal, investigation, questions about his family's stability, potential legal consequences, even if Edward Jr. was never formally tried due to his age. We report that the deaths were investigated and found to be the result of tragic accidents and illness, Edward said finally. Nothing more. We owe it to Catherine and to Margaret's memory to avoid scandal if possible. As for Lily, he paused, his expression hardening. Hannah, you're certain she wasn't involved? Yes, sir. Master Edward Jr. told me he framed her. Then she deserves a better burial. Barrett, have her remains moved to the proper cemetery. Mark her grave appropriately. It was a small justice, but Hannah felt something in her chest ease slightly at the acknowledgement. Edward looked at Hannah again, his expression complex. You've served this family well in a situation where many would have chosen self-preservation over truth. I won't forget that. You may return to your duties. It was dismissal and reprieve combined. Hannah left the study with trembling legs, hardly believing she had survived the conversation. Edward Jr. was sent away 5 days later to an institution in Pennsylvania, departing in the middle of the night to avoid attention. Hannah watched from her kitchen window as the carriage carried him into darkness, taking with him the truth about what had happened at Riverside Estate. The official story, as Edward had decreed, attributed the deaths to tragic circumstances, illness, accidents, the unfortunate but ultimately natural losses that accompanied plantation life. Samuel's age, Ruth's pregnancy complication, Jonas's food poisoning, Margaret's sudden illness, and Lily's supposed grief-driven suicide. The narrative was tidy, plausible, and completely false. But within the estate's black community, the real story spread through whispers and significant glances. Hannah's role was understood without being spoken of, her courage and the impossible position she had navigated becoming part of the unwritten history that existed beneath the surface of official records. Catherine Collier recovered slowly from her grief, clinging to her unborn child as if it might redeem the loss of the daughter murdered by her son. She never spoke to Hannah directly about what had happened, but she began leaving small gifts in the kitchen: extra fabric, a better blanket, jars of preserves from her personal stores, gestures of acknowledgement that couldn't be expressed in words. Edward himself changed after the revelation, becoming quieter, older, the weight of his son's crimes aging him in ways that financial stress hadn't managed. His relationship with Catherine grew distant, both of them carrying guilt and grief that had no outlet. The estate continued operating, cotton planted and harvested, sugar operations eventually abandoned after another unprofitable year. The financial pressures that had formed the backdrop to murder persisted, though Edward ultimately managed to maintain ownership by borrowing more extensively and mortgaging his future against the slim hope of better harvests. Hannah remained in her kitchen, cooking meals and maintaining her routines, carrying knowledge that no one else could fully understand. She had survived by being clever, by gathering information, by understanding the plantation's ecology of secrets and power. But survival had required compromises that haunted her. She had remained silent while people died. She had prioritized her own safety over immediate action. She had gathered evidence while Jonas suffered, while Margaret was killed, while Lily was framed and murdered. Her eventual decision to speak had saved Catherine, but came too late for the others. Was she a survivor who had done the best she could in an impossible situation? Or was she complicit through her silence in deaths she might have prevented if she'd been willing to sacrifice herself sooner? She didn't know. Perhaps she never would. But she understood one truth with absolute clarity. In a world structured by slavery, where some people owned others and power was distributed according to skin color rather than merit, justice was always incomplete. The best she could do was survive, bear witness, and hope that someday, somewhere, the full truth might matter. She continued her work with the poisons that grew around the estate, that knowledge that had become both shield and burden. She knew every deadly plant, every toxic berry, every poisonous seed. She knew how they worked, how they killed, how they might be disguised. It was knowledge she would never use, but would never relinquish. In a world where she had so little control over her own life, where death could come suddenly from those who owned her, understanding the mechanisms of poison represented a strange form of power. The knowledge that if circumstances became absolutely unbearable, if life became worse than death, she had options. That knowledge was her secret insurance, locked away in her mind alongside all the other secrets she carried. The truth about Margaret's murder, the reality of Edward Jr.'s nature, the evidence of Edward's financial desperation and Catherine's fragility. She was the keeper of Riverside Estate's darkest truths, the one person who understood the full scope of what had happened in 1841, and she would take most of those truths to her grave, because speaking them would serve no purpose except to endanger herself further. This was survival in the antebellum South, bearing witness in silence, carrying truth without the power to speak it, navigating between danger and discretion with only knowledge as a shield. Hannah returned to her vegetables and her cooking fire, to the endless rhythms of plantation life, carrying her secrets like stones in her pocket, heavy, permanent, hidden. The kitchen remained her kingdom, small and hot and filled with the daily work of feeding people who didn't see her as fully human. But she saw everything. She understood everything. And she would remember everything, even if history never recorded her name or acknowledged her role in the events of 1841. The cook who knew every poison used in the house had survived. And in surviving, she had ensured that at least one person knew the truth about what had happened at Riverside Estate, even if that truth would never be officially recorded. It was a small victory, perhaps. But for someone with as little power as Hannah, any victory was worth claiming, even one that existed only in memory and silence.